Welcome to Cover Book Beat. This is show number 848. Our guest today has a long resume that includes 3 Oscars and Emmy nomination as well. He has nearly half a century as a professor of film. He is an award-winning author of 10 books and a crime reporting background that includes a stint at the Associated Press. He's been interviewed by Good Morning America, The Charlie Rose Show, The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. But for all he's accomplished, he said he's most proud to use his storytelling gift in his new book, Misfits, to share moving and inspiring stories that explore the resilience of the human spirit. We're very pleased to welcome Mark Jonathan Harris.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, before we get to the book Misfits, which is, and I don't use the term lightly, a work of real art, a very odd question. What do you do with an Oscar, particularly if you have 3 of them? Do you line them up in the mantle? Are you bragging? If you put them in a closet, are you disrespecting?
Well, if you look behind me, 2 of them are there on the bookcase right there, among a bunch of other statues. Yeah.
I have to remember, I have to quote you this one. After Tom Hanks won the Oscar for Forrest Gump, he was on a late night talk show, and they asked him what he did with it. And he said, I bolted it to the hood of the Buick and drove around the neighborhood. It was obviously a joke, but it got a good laugh. So were you always going to be an author?
Yes, for a long time, I think from college on, I wanted to write. I've always written, but I fell in love with films when I was in college. And that was, in the early 60s, that was the French New Wave, Ingmar Bergman, Antonioni, Fellini. And I also discovered documentaries at that time. But I didn't, when I left college, I didn't know how to get into the film industry. It was very difficult. In fact, I went to see an advisor and someone who'd been in the film business for a long time, a large man, sat behind a desk, and he said, I said, I want to get into movies. He said, is your father very rich? I said, no. He said, have you written a best-selling book yet? I said, no. He said, those are 2 ways I know how to get into the movie. Your father pays for the film, or Hollywood buys it, and you get to go there and write the script.
Yeah.
So I started out as a newspaper reporter instead.
Yeah. Well, I share that background with you, so it's nice to see one of our boys do well. So, both reporters and filmmakers have to have both a good eye and a good ear. So, have those experiences informed your writing?
Yes, I think definitely. As a newspaper reporter, you look for the salient detail. You have to write concisely, and you have to find a way to convey what you're seeing in really the fewest possible words. So that did help me, I think, become a better writer, and I'm sure it's informed my style.
Uh, there is a particular sensitivity to these stories, and I'm wondering if that Oscar award-winning documentary from 2001, Into the Arms of Strangers, Stories of the Kindertransport, was one thing that increased that sensitivity in you, seeing the plight and all of the people involved in that particular story.
I think as a documentary filmmaker, one of the things that I've learned is empathy. I think the 2 qualities that make a strong documentary filmmaker are curiosity and also empathy. I've always believed, as a filmmaker, in the definition of documentary is to introduce one segment of society to another. And now, of course, we're living in a global world. It's introducing one part of the world to the other. But yeah, that's, I think, informed my storytelling too. And, I came to Los Angeles. I've been here a long time. And Los Angeles, I see it as like the Ellis Island of the 21st century. So many different groups, so many different subcultures. And so my stories sort of reflect that kaleidoscope world that's here in LA. It's a world of no one. Well, there are people these days who are born in LA, but most people have come to LA from someplace else.
Well, I had the feeling in reading these that Los Angeles itself becomes a bit of a character, not just the backdrop.
No, definitely. I think Los Angeles is a character, and for many years I taught filmmaking at the University of Southern California, and we had a documentary class where the students produced three different documentaries each semester, and that was like a window into the world of Los Angeles because they, first of all, the students come from all different backgrounds, and the subjects that they focused on was like a window into the world of Los Angeles. Everything from Samoan wrestlers to Korean shop owners to. I mean, it's just it, I learned a lot from watching hundreds of hours of dailies of people I would otherwise never have met. And that I think that's part of the source of some of the films some of the stories that I've done.
Well, you said the documentary projects are not something you do overnight. It takes you a long time. You have to raise money. You have to, once you
Yes.
you have to do the production, the whole different sets of skills. But some of those transfer into being an author in terms of you've got to market the product once you've sold it or once you've produced it.
Yeah, I mean, I think documentary filmmaking and writing fictional stories have more in common than differences. They're different media, but it's all in documentaries you find real people. In fiction, the characters are imagined or made up, or they're composite figures. Uh, but otherwise, it's about telling a compelling story. The other difference is media is for documentary films, you got to raise money. To write a story, you can just go to your computer. And a lot of these stories uh, were written during COVID when I couldn't make films, or they started earlier uh, as a kind of release from the arduous job of raising funds. That few filmmakers like doing that. And I mean, there's three phases of making a documentary film. You got to raise the funds, then you make the film, which is the part that everybody enjoys. Then there's the distribution, which is trying to get the films to the audience that would like to see it, or the audience you hope sees it. And that's another set of skills. And I think I have strong skills as a filmmaker, less skills as raising money, and less patience in terms of distributing.
You know, I think maybe this Doom format gives you a chance to say some things you couldn't say in a documentary.
Yes, definitely. I mean, some of the stories are issues that are still haunted me even after finishing them. And the other thing is that I think in writing, you're able to get inside a person's head much more easily than you can in film. In film, we understand what people are thinking or feeling largely through their behavior, through their actions, what they do. But in fiction, you can get inside their head. You can much more easily. It's interesting. When I wrote children's books, I remember uh, speaking to school, and this little 12-year-old girl came up to me and she said, "I don't get it." She said, "Why do you write books when you can make films?" And she said, "Films are like taking a jet plane. Uh, Books are like taking a train." And I said, "Yeah, that's probably true, but you see much more from a train window than you do flying 30,000 feet in the air." Uh, and so it's a different perspective. You get much more inside of someone's head, I think, writing stories.
Four of the stories are first person and the others are not. Were those more critical to you, and do they reflect more of you?
Uh, um, I'm not sure. It is an interesting question. Probably, I found that voice the voice of the narrator was easier for me to do in the first person in those stories.
Mhm.
But all stories are they're not you. The characters are not you, but the stories are you. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like the characters may not be anything like you, but they certainly reflect you and your sensibilities.
That's interesting because my question I had written out here is it's almost always a mistake to believe the views expressed by the writer's character accurately reflect the views of the writer. There's one quote, though, I do have to ask you about. In Damascus, the final story of the book, the
Yes.
unnamed protagonist says, I'll say this about the lottery, though. Unlike Hollywood, it doesn't penalize you for talent, taste, or intelligence. Is that your thought sneaking through?
Yes, absurdly. That may be my thought as a frustrated screenwriter. I have written, fictional screenplays, and many of my books have been optioned for movies, but none of them have materialized on the screen. So yes, I'm sure that is a reflection of my own experience.
Speaking of that, I noticed, I'm sure that A Drink with Oppie, one of the stories, predates the whole Oppenheimer movie phenomenon. Yeah.
Yeah. So what is the question?
I'm sorry. I just want to make sure that they copied you rather than you copied them.
I don't think I don't think Christopher Nolan read the story, but the story existed, yes, before Oppenheimer. Uh, Oppenheimer is such a enigmatic and fascinating character that I think he's attracted a lot of people. Because even in the Oppenheimer film, which I admired, it's still he's an enigma in many ways, and because he's such a contradictory character. And that's what I was trying to get at in the story. I was trying to connect the personal to the political to see if there was any connection in that way.
Yeah, fascinating, by the way. And all of the stories are fascinating. I mean, I don't mean to single some of them out, but it seems to me that there is a bit of a melancholy, but there's also a bit of hope in there too.
Uh, like life.
Yes, indeed
uh,
it is.
there is a bittersweet quality to some of the stories, but a lot of the films that I've made, and so I think the stories also reflect my experience as a filmmaker. A lot of the stories that of the films that I've made have been about tremendous catastrophes. They've been about genocide. I made a film about Darfur. My son used to joke. Someone asked him once, "What kind of films does your father make?" And he said, if it's genocide, call my dad. So I've done Holocaust, I've done genocide, I've done um, films about child slavery, child poverty. Um, so a lot of the experiences I've seen have been very disheartening. But at the same time, I've always looked for some kind of resilience or hope. And in the films I've done about the Holocaust, the questions I were generally asking was not the questions that earlier filmmakers asked, how could this have happened? I'm asking, how can they rebuild their lives after such a terrible?
Resilience seems to run through everything you do.
Yeah, I think it all comes from our own experiences, and as both adults and children. And I mean, Foster is very much that film, and then there's a story in the book that also is about that the youth in the foster care system is about trying to overcome great odds. Um, and the film that many people see children in foster care as irredeemably damaged. And certainly their experience is often very difficult and very traumatic, and they come with a lot of deficits. But children in foster care can also show great resilience. And I think um, a lot of the stories and the films that I've made try to look at things with more nuance. We live in a world right now where everything is black and white. And I think the world is more complicated and more nuanced than that.
It is indeed. I love books that send me to the internet or send me to dictionaries, new concepts, and there are a bunch of them in here. I learned a new word, hayduke. Never heard of that before, and I'm practicing journalist for many years.
Well,
Never came across that. Tell people about hayduke, because it features in one of your stories.
again, the word I'm missing the word that you have.
Hayduke,
Oh,
Hayduke.
oh, hey, dude, that
Yeah.
comes from that's the comes from the book. I'm blanking on his name. Who wrote Abby?
Mhm.
Uh, the writer who wrote books about eco-terrorism, Edward Abbey.
Yes.
All right, and Hayduke was one of the characters in his book.
And it's used as people who are environmental activists.
Yes, yes. He's the protagonist of a band of characters in Edward Abbey's book that is really about trying to sabotage it. So the little girl in Misfits uh, uses that as an expression.
Right. I also loved to learn about the 3 foot tall French jazz pianist. I'm probably going to screw up his name here. Michel Petrucci.
Bishop Petrucciani, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful jazz pianist. Yeah.
And as a result of that, my wife, who's kind of learning her way into jazz, has a CD from him on her way, on this way. She doesn't know it yet, but thanks to you, she's going to get
Oh,
exposed to
great.
it.
He's a wonderful musician. I almost did a film about him, and that's how I know about him. It was one of the projects that didn't end up finally materializing, but I did a lot of research about him, and I love his music.
Were there more stories that didn't make it into this book for number
Uh,
two?
no, there are a couple more stories I've written since, but and there are a few earlier stories that very early stories that I wrote that and looking at them over the years, they didn't hold up, some of my earlier stories. And I've written a couple lately that have been published. I've been writing, one of the things I hope to do one day is put together a book of fairy tales. And I've written two that have been published. And I have three more in mind. I hope to get to them. And maybe it's another children's book, but also these fairy tales are more, I think they can be for all ages.
Fascinating. You explore a lot of genres, don't you?
I do. My approach is very eclectic, but I like fairy tales were something that I liked as a child.
Mhm.
Um, I'm also I like detective fiction. I'm a very eclectic reader, as I gather you are too.
Indeed, and this is the fact. One of my favorite quotes is, "Of course, you don't have enough shelves for your books. If you did, you wouldn't be worth knowing."
That's right.
There are a dozen stories here, and you're just thinking of them. Are these the apostles of your message?
Is there a message? I think in what a common trait of all the stories are people who are looking for connection or meaning. There's a sense of alienation and that a lot of people feel, and a sense of powerlessness facing some of the issues that are confronting us. Misfits is an example. The girl in Misfits I empathize with a lot. It's the because I have children, grandchildren, facing the issues of climate change, and they look at it much differently than their parents. Their parents. It's like they've inherited a world that seems to them a much greater crisis than it seems to us. And because they know that they're going to have to live through this, it's like they're saying, you're going to be dead, but we're going to have to deal with these complications. And that generational divide, I think, affects a lot of our politics right now, and certainly um, so a lot of the stories are about people dealing with these overwhelming issues and feeling like they can't find a way to connect with them or with other people. So I think that is a common theme throughout. Um, and people are looking for answers. And I hope, in the stories, um, which are often about painful things, that there is some humor in the stories, something to leaven the pain and difficulties that these characters are facing.
And there are bits and pieces that are so wonderful. And I wanted to quote one or two of you. I have to tell you, when I read books, I take notes. And I've got something like 15 pages of notes of lines from
Wow. Well, I'm glad that that stirred that in you. Yeah.
you have done. One of the things that I liked to hear was you wrote, names have power. They bring certainty, clarity. The right title for a movie can make a difference between success and failure. But success, naming a child is fraught with possibilities in either direction as well. I think that's an aspect a lot of us don't think about as often as we could.
No, I think that's true. Naming things can be very powerful.
Yeah. In fact, one of the things, having interviewed many, many politicians over the years, is when they design a bill, they look for a title like Positive American Act for it so that they
Yes.
can cast it the best possible way. So
Right. And look at it. I mean, a good example is Obamacare.
yes,
It carries different connotations for different people, but it was certainly when the Republicans named it Obamacare, it was not with affection.
no, no. And again, it's the framing of how you frame something is going to respond very differently.
Yes.
You talk, though most of the stuff is set in Los Angeles and environs. You do have a flashback in the Mink Coat where you talk a bit about Montreal, which you call divided by class and language and ideology, and then you say Chicago is a place where contradictions are more easily tolerated. I find that some interesting insights.
Well, I lived in both Montreal and Chicago at different times, and so I saw the contrast between those two cities. And I lived in Montreal at a very interesting time where there's a lot of tension between the English and French-speaking people in Montreal. Uh, and that was the time of the War Measures Act, when there was kidnapping of some of the officials by the Quebecois.
Mhm.
And yeah, you could see this. It was a city that was very divided.
Again, I just remembered about when you're talking about names, going back to the cactus, and I don't want to give anything away, but he said he would name her Mirabelle for the rare Echinopsis mirabilis, the flower of prayer. That's such a sweet moment in the story.
Um, yeah, when you write stories, I mean, or at least when I write stories, you start with a premise, you start with characters, you don't always know where it's going to lead. Uh, and certainly when I started writing that, I didn't think exactly of that ending, but it just grew out of everything that had come before.
Are you a pantser or a plotter, as they say?
I'm not a plotter.
Ah, okay. Pantser meaning you write from seat of the pants. You sit down, you let it flow.
Yeah, I mean, I have a destination where I'm going
Mhm.
to in that way, but no, I find plotting is not my great strength. Um, I'd like to be surprised while I'm writing, and I figure if I'm surprised by what my characters are doing, that the reader will be surprised too. Uh, what it ends up is when I get to the end, I often do a lot of rewriting because, oh, this is where the story has gone. I didn't expect it to go there. Now I have to go back and make sure that everything that leads up to it makes sense.
It's and those of us who've written for journalism talk about the buried lead. You get the story halfway written and realize that down there is where it should be up at the beginning, and you have to rewrite to suit. Right.
Right. Absolutely, yeah. And so uh, the plotting is kind of reverse plotting. It's like, let's see, we're going on a journey, and that comes to some extent from my documentary training.
Right.
Documentary, you start with a question, and it's an exploration, and it's an exploration in real time. You don't know what's going to happen, where you're going to go. I mean, I believe that in Godard's statement about film, that a good film is an answer to questions properly posed. So it's like when you start out, what's the question you're out to explore? You need to define that pretty clearly, although the question can change as you make the film, but that's your starting point. It's like, here's what I'm out to investigate. And I think I follow the same method in writing stories. Is okay, I have this idea, these characters meet, this is the question that I'm trying to explore, and where does it take me? And then at the end you see, it's taken me a completely different direction than I thought, or yeah, it's taken me to where I thought I'd go, but I need to go back and make sure that everything makes sense and getting there.
Right, right. That's part of the fun of it.
It is. I mean, look, when we're talking about the difference between film, film, if you write a book and 5,000 people read the book, it's maybe considered a successful book. If you make a film and only 5,000 people see it, it's an abysmal failure. You're not going to get to make any other films. So you're you have to reach a much wider audience in film because it's so expensive to make films.
Yeah.
Even documentaries are expensive.
It's interesting because I think of it as comparing to scientific research, where you start with a premise, then you go investigate, and results determine what happens.
Exactly. Well, it is very similar. It's a similar creative process, definitely.
Yeah. Where do you see your attention turning next?
Um, I'm actually finishing up a documentary which is intended for PBS about old age in America.
Hmm.
Uh, and I have a stake in that. And I'm investigating, we're moving to, I forget the exact statistics, but uh, I think by 2030, there will be more people in the United States over 65 than under 18. We're moving to an older society. And the question is, are we prepared for it? Are our social policies adequate to deal with the aging of the population? So that's a film that I'm working on. And then I'm working on a novel and that is in its early stages.
You can't sit still. I just understand that about you. Yeah.
Yeah, yes. Uh, my wife would say I'm a workaholic, but I like what I'm doing. Is when you like what you're doing, you want to continue doing it.
Well, as Dad used to say, if you like what you're doing, you never work a day in your life.
Right. Well, only the work for me is trying to raise money. That's work.
Yeah, it is. It is indeed. Is there anything we've not touched on you want to make sure to explore?
Um, No, I think, I'm happy that the book has been so provocative for you. I think I'd like to mention my website,
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
www.markjharriswrites.com. And, I hope that people will go and, discover the book. And, also perhaps look at some of my films that are still relevant. Foster is one of them. They're still available, the Holocaust films, but also a film that I made several years ago called Breaking Point, the War for Democracy in Ukraine, that I co-directed with Ola Sanyan, a terrific Ukrainian director, which was about the revolution in Ukraine that ousted the president and leads into the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the war in the East. And it's a film that I'm very proud of, and I think it's incredibly relevant now.
Probably more relevant now than ever, actually.
Yes, and it's more relevant than it was at the time it was made. Yes.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much. Our guest today has been Mark Jonathan Harris. The book is Misfits. I give it the highest possible recommendation. Go out and buy copies for all your friends. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Roger. I really appreciate it. Great to meet you.